2014, McCarthy lectured for the lecture series this academic year. As I mentioned in the email that went out today, we're actually going to have a kind of an encore lecture in April with Dr. Jeffrey Gray, who teaches at the Australian Defence Forces Academy. He'll be here to talk about, we think, almost definitely journalism during World War I, but we're still fine-tuning that, so stay tuned, stay tuned. As always, we want to thank Craig Howard and Richard McCarthy for their sponsorship of this lecture series and making all of this possible. And I just want to thank all of you all for coming out tonight. I know everyone's getting tired, and for those of you actively involved in academics, the semester is getting into full swing, so we're pleased you're here. Our speaker tonight is our own Dr. Heather Stur, a Dale Center faculty fellow who earned her Ph.D. from Wisconsin in 2008. Dr. Stur was also the first Nina Bell Suggs Professor, which was awarded in the spring of 2012 and supports the research and teaching efforts of junior faculty. Dr. Stur was on a Fulbright in Vietnam last year, as many of you know, from 2013 to 2014, and she also serves as the director of the Vietnam Summer Studies Program. Her first book was Beyond Combat, Women and Gender in the Vietnam War Era, published by Cambridge University Press, a very, very good one, in 2011. And she's currently working on two projects, Saigon in the 60s, Vietnamese Americans and the Culture of the Vietnam War, and E6, and the Coke Girl, a story of love found and lost in Vietnam, which somebody has to remember to ask her about because it's an awesome story. And I should say what you're going to talk about tonight. Heather tonight is going to be talking about Dickey Chapelle, which the more I find out about, the more embarrassed I am that I had never heard of her until you posted a photo of her on Facebook about a year or so ago, which got us talking about journalism and war and really sparked this entire series. So, without further ado, Dr. Stur.
Thank you, Susanna, and thank you all for coming. I'm really happy to be the final act in at least the fall edition of the 2014-15 McCarthy Lecture Series. And I'm excited to be able to share some stories and photographs with you about Dickey Chapelle, who was a war correspondent and journalist from World War II through the Vietnam War. She's best known for having been killed in Vietnam, but that's actually the least interesting and least significant aspect of her story. In her capacity as a journalist, she was witness to some of the biggest, most transformative world events of the early Cold War. She was at Iwo Jima, she was at the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, she was at the U.S. Marine invasion of Lebanon in 1958, she was in Cuba in 1959, she was in the Dominican Republic, she was, I don't know that she would call this, but she was embedded with Algerian rebels during the Algerian War for Independence, and she was at the Vietnam War. So really some of the biggest events of 20th century history, definitely of the post-45 era. She also for a time worked for a U.S. government foreign aid program. And in that capacity, she spent time in India, Iraq, and Iran. And so she was truly a witness to the Cold War world. Again, to that post-45 period up to 1965 when she died. Her background is very interesting, and I'll talk a little bit about her background, but she was born into a pacifist Quaker family in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But she became a vocal war hawk, and that is because of what she saw both in her capacity as a journalist and then working for these government aid humanitarian programs. She believed that communism was not the answer to the problems of the post-45 world, especially the developing world. And so because of that, she took on a political stance that was very different from the political climate that she had grown up in. And so tonight I'm going to talk about her as a witness to the end of the Second World War and to the beginning development of the Cold War world. And like I said, we'll look at some of the images as well as learn about her. I have about 40 images on this PowerPoint because the Wisconsin Historical Society has digitized more than 400 of her pictures. And so it's a fantastic archive to be able to see the work that she did. So she was born Georgette Louise Meyer in 1919 in Milwaukee, And she grew up in a suburb called Shorewood, which is just north of the city of Milwaukee. And we could say that even from a very young age, she was a fairly unconventional person. Her childhood hero was Admiral Richard Byrd, who was a U.S. naval officer and an aviator who was known for his expeditions to the North and South Poles. And the reason why she adopted the nickname of Dickey is because that's a variation on the name Richard. So again, even as a child, she was, I think by most standards, somewhat unconventional. Her fascination with Byrd was connected to her fascination with flying. And her original career desire was to be a pilot. But when she was in high school in the 1930s and she told her parents she wanted to be a pilot, they said no. But they did approve of her going to college. And her mother said to her, as the story goes, that, well, you're not going to fly planes, but maybe you can design them. So she ended up getting a scholarship to go to MIT. She was valedictorian of her high school class. So she got a scholarship to MIT, went to MIT, but she failed out after about 2 years because she was spending too much time hanging out at the Boston airport, watching planes take off and land, and hanging out with pilots, trying to get on flights and just sort of be in that world. There was a time in which the city of Worcester, Mass. Had a flood, and she joined an aid airlift flight. And on that flight solidified her love of flying and sparked her interest in journalism. That being part of that experience made her want to kind of be where the action is. And so that kind of began the initial interest in journalism. And so she became a stringer for Boston newspapers until she had to go home to Milwaukee because she had failed out of MIT. Well, after she went home, her parents sent her to Coral Gables, Florida to live with her grandparents. And there she got a job as a publicist. The job that she applied for was a secretary job, which would have been one of the few jobs available to a woman, but her employer figured out that she could write. And so she got assigned to do stories covering air shows in the Coral Gables area. And she was able to build a portfolio, a clip file, that got her to New York City. And she moved to New York City and began working as a freelance reporter for a variety of publications. It was in New York that she met a man 20 years her senior named Tony Chapelle, who eventually became her husband. He was a photographer. They got married in October of 1940, and even though they would go on to divorce in 1955, they were partners in covering some of the big events that Dickey Chapelle got to cover, particularly World War II and the early 1950s, some of the humanitarian aid coverage that she did in the 50s. And so in some ways, her marriage to Tony Chapelle really helped her career take off because he had a lot of connections. Again, he was a photographer 20 years older than her, had a lot of experience, and by being associated with him, she was able to get into spaces and worlds that she might not otherwise have been able to get into, although in what I've learned about her in doing research for this talk, I think she probably would have figured out a way. And you'll see that too as you learn more about her as well. But he did help her career take off. Her first big break, and I'll just show you a couple more. This is her, of course, and then just a couple more pictures of her. I like this one because she's with pilots. She became a parachutist later on. I'll explain a bit about that when she was in Vietnam, but I think that was probably when she was happiest, was when she was hanging out with pilots and flying. But her first big break was World War II. She wrote a story about American pilots who had gone across the border to Canada and joined the Royal Canadian Air Force because they wanted to fight the Nazis. So this is before the U.S. is in the war. Dickey Chapelle found out about this, and she wrote a story about the pilots, and she sold it to the New York Times. And that got a lot of attention. And so after doing that, she was on the radar screen of editors for a number of different publications. So her first overseas assignment was to go and cover the Panama Canal Zone in early 1942. She was sent there by Look magazine. That was her first overseas assignment. Then, February of 1945, as the Marines are landing at Iwo Jima, Dickey Chapelle wants to be there. And so she convinces an editor at a magazine called Life Story to send her there. And she was assigned to a hospital ship and a field hospital. And so she captured images and wrote about wounded US Marines in Iwo Jima. She wanted to capture the realities of war. These were not pictures that were lighthearted. Dickey Chapelle did not see herself as a reporter who was writing for or photographing for what would have been called the women's pages of a newspaper at that time. She wanted the hardcore, frontline realities of war, and so she covered wounded Marines. This isn't because she was anti-war, as I mentioned earlier, and you'll see as this develops. It's not about her stance on war. What she wanted to do was show honestly what war did to people. And so I'll show you a few images from Iwo Jima. So this is the medical staging area. All of these, the next couple that I'm going to show you, are kind of variations on the same general area, which is a medical staging area for US Marines in Iwo Jima. And so like I said, she didn't want to turn her camera away from the tough pictures, you know, the pictures that aren't necessarily easy to look at, because she wanted to convey what war did to the U.S. or what Iwo Jima, the experience at Iwo Jima, did to U.S. Marines. This is a picture of some men lifting a wounded man off of a ship, and then a couple of medics caring for a wounded Marine, flight nurse. This picture I love. It really captures kind of the humanness, and I think that was one of the things that she was trying to do, is capture the humanness of these soldiers. And so this, I mean, he looks so young. You know, he's probably in his mid-20s, but still, and so compared to Vietnam, you know, the context that I'm more familiar with, that's not that young. But when we look at him, he just looks so young. And so I think she really was trying to drive home the humanness of these soldiers. Again, regardless of politics, just drive home the humanness of them. In addition to going to Iwo Jima, Dickey Chapelle also went to Okinawa in 1945. And again, she was there to cover the carnage and the experiences of US Marines in Okinawa. And again, to be as close to the action, whatever the action was, as possible. So there's a legend, maybe it was true, that when she was in Okinawa, at one point she held the lamp while a surgeon was operating on an 18-year-old Marine. So lots of stories developed around her too, about her being really close to the action and being involved there with the troops. But the Marines didn't want her in Okinawa. They hadn't wanted her in Iwo Jima because they considered her a security risk. How are they going to protect her? How are they going to make sure that she knew the protocols, that she didn't get herself in trouble? And so she was eventually forced to leave Okinawa and go back to the US. But her experiences in World War II with the US Marines in the Pacific led to a lifelong admiration for the Marines on the part of Dickey Chapelle. And in 1955, she spent several weeks at Camp Pendleton in Southern California observing the daily activities of Marines. And this is just one of the pictures that she took of that, or that was taken of her taking a picture during that experience. She also wrote about Marine families and photographed Marine families, as well as photographing the Marines themselves. In addition to this assignment at Camp Pendleton, she also in the early 1960s went back to Okinawa and photographed Vietnam, or Marines training for Vietnam in Okinawa. And one of the things that I found really interesting, and she conveyed in a profound way in her coverage of the Marines training for Vietnam on Okinawa, was their youth and their relative, either we could say innocence or maybe even naivete. So I'll give you just two quotes from one of her articles about that experience. And again, this is the Vietnam Marines training in Okinawa. What young Americans there can hardly be expected to learn about is the whole subject of mortality, their own and their enemies. At home, they cannot come to believe real history is still being written by the ability of young men to kill with tools so small a man can run with one in his hand. And then she went on to say that this inability to imagine death meant that back at Camp Pendleton, young Marines, maybe they were reckless or they just didn't realize that mortality was something that they could and should be thinking about. She said, they are disciplined within familiar limits and so little dread the consequences of violence on their persons that they fight for fun and cannot be persuaded to drive a car with half the prudence of civilians, to quote from recent insurance statistics. All of these are attitudes that can be suicidal in combat. Dickey Chapelle had strong opinions about the U.S. military and how soldiers needed to be trained to face the various global challenges of the post-1945 world. She took this seriously because, as I said, she was a staunch anti-communist and she was a world traveler. So she went to some of the places that she's now thinking about the U.S. being involved in. In the early 1950s, Tony and Dickey Chapelle, still married at the time, were hired by the U.S. government to document a humanitarian aid program, technical assistance program called Point 4. It was a program from President Harry Truman that was designed to take U.S. technical assistance to the developing world. And so this is where Dickey Chapelle was able to travel to India, Iraq, and Iran, documenting the conditions in those countries and documenting the work of the Point 4 program. And she wrote articles and took pictures for the program and for American magazines and newspapers. So I'll just give you a kind of a brief synopsis of where she was and what she saw in these three places. So in India, they were in the village of Birlinga, which is in eastern India, and there she photographed and wrote about projects aimed at agricultural technology, at education, and at building a medical clinic. This is a remote village that didn't have any kind of medical care, modern medical care, anywhere nearby, hundreds of miles from anything like that. In Iraq, the focus was on locust control, because apparently, because of changing wind patterns, the desert locust had begun to migrate to the fertile northern parts of Iraq, the old Mesopotamia, and had begun to damage crops. And the idea was that if that locust wasn't controlled, that it would lead to famine. And so in Iraq, the focus was on that. And then in Iran, the emphasis was on things like clean water, malaria control, and education. Dickey Chapelle's articles on this experience are really interesting because you can see her Cold War worldview very clearly in the ways in which she wrote about her experiences. Like I said, she was a staunch anti-communist, and she was a liberal internationalist. And so what I mean by that is that she believed that the U.S. should intervene in other countries to pursue liberal development. So liberal meaning like liberty. So the U.S. should intervene in other countries to pursue the development of democracies, that this is the preferable system to totalitarianism or tribalism or any other sort of non-democratic, non-liberal government. And in the context of the Cold War, liberal internationalism meant fighting the expansion of communism. So that's how, for Dickey Chapelle, these two ideologies came together in the early Cold War. And this could involve humanitarian aid programs like the Point 4 program or the Marshall Plan, or this could involve military intervention, and often it involved both. And again, this, for Dickey Chapelle, was a responsibility of the United States, that given the technological advancement of the United States, the financial state of the U.S., and that the U.S. had achieved the highest standard of living in the world at that time, that Americans had a responsibility to sort of uplift the developing world. And she saw this as a benevolent responsibility. She wrote an article entitled Iranian Teenager about a 14-year-old girl named Zahra Hafizi and her family. And I'm just going to read this quote from that article because it encapsulates that ideology. She's talking about how the Point 4 initiatives had expanded Zahra's worldview, and that Zahra has learned that in the world beyond, there are lands where babies do not regularly die of measles, where water flows from faucets right in the kitchen, and where almost everybody can read and write. vaguely, she feels that she has a part to play in helping achieve these same things for her own people. Dickey Chapelle articulated her worldview in a similar way in a booklet entitled How the Other Half Lives, which was published in 1955. So in that book, she talks about poverty and lack of freedom in the developing world. She talks about things like no clean water, low literacy rates, poor health care, low life expectancy. And as she did when she was covering the Point 4 program, she argued that because of what the U.S. had, the abundance that the United States had, the U.S. had a responsibility to provide some opportunity for uplift, or to come in and uplift people in the developing world. So that the U.S. should be exporting its system of government and its system of economics to the developing world. This was not just benevolent. Part of the idea here is that if the U.S. helps to build liberal democracies, then the U.S. will be secure, which is a central tenet of U.S. foreign policy going at least back to the late 19th century and continuing into the present day. She articulated that exact worldview in her writings and frankly in her pictures. And so Dickey Chapelle's work is an interesting window on the liberal internationalism that many Americans espoused during the early Cold War. Now, when Dickey Chapelle was not covering humanitarian aid efforts, and that was really just kind of a small part of the work she did, mostly what she did was cover wars, including some of the most significant revolutions of the post-1945 era. Starting in Hungary in late 1956, this is a picture that Dickey Chapelle took of a Hungarian woman trying to escape across the border from Hungary into Austria, which was kind of the main area way of movement for Hungarian refugees trying to escape Hungary in 1956. So the Hungarian Revolution ended in November 1956. It was a failure. And in December of 56, Dickey Chapelle went to Hungary to cover the International Rescue Committee, which was in Austria. I should say she went to Austria. She winds up in Hungary. She went to Austria, where the International Rescue Committee was providing penicillin and other medicines for Hungarian refugees, particularly children, who had escaped across the border into Austria. Well, while Dickey Chapelle was covering this initiative, she met two Hungarians who were planning to smuggle some medicines back across the border into Hungary to give them out to those Hungarians who hadn't been able to escape. So this probably isn't a surprise at this point, but of course Dickey Chapelle wanted to go with, and so she did. And in December of '56, she and two Hungarians crossed the border into Hungary. She didn't have a visa. They crossed the border into Hungary. They were in kind of a wooded area, and very quickly after they crossed in, they were arrested by a Russian guard. At least one of the Hungarian companions of Chapelle was shot and killed. And then Dickey Chapelle was put into a Hungarian prison for 52 days, 38 of which were in solitary confinement. So she was repeatedly, in that experience, threatened with torture, rape, and execution. I don't know the details of what her experience was like in the prison, other than the solitary confinement, and that she reported that she had been threatened with rape, execution, and torture. But the U.S. State Department eventually was able to negotiate her release, and Dickey Chapelle was banned from Hungary for the rest of her life, which I guess is probably not a surprise. After her ordeal in Hungary, she makes her way to Algeria. And it's, again, this is another subject matter where someone's got to make a movie on this, because you really can't make this up. So in 1957, a New York newspaper syndicate wanted Dickey Chapelle to go to Algeria and cover the rebel side of the Algerian War for Independence. This was a dangerous assignment, because the belief was that the pro-French forces, if they found her and found that she was covering the rebels, would slit her throat to kill her. And interestingly, the rebels that she ended up being kind of embedded with said that, yeah, they will slit your throat, but first they'll face you towards Mecca, then slit your throat and say that, tell the world that we did it. that the Muslim rebels did it. So she couldn't just go. She couldn't just get on a plane and land in Algeria and find the rebels and cover them. So the newspaper syndicate that hired her got with a UN representative who arranged a fake kidnapping of her at a hotel in New York City. So she was pretend kidnapped, and she was in on it, fake kidnapping, and she went underground in Algeria with the Front for National Liberation in Algeria. She spent a month there, and so we could kind of say she was embedded. But she spent a month there again. She was underground. If she was discovered, what she was told is that she probably would be killed. If she was discovered by the pro-French side in the war, that she would probably be killed. But she spent a month there, took more than 100 pictures, wrote articles that were published in several different American magazines, and had just really interesting conversations with some of the men that she was assigned to. So this is her sitting, talking, and having coffee or tea or something. One of the things that some of the men, particularly the man by the name of Ben Chaffa, who was the ranking officer of the rebel unit she was assigned to, he told her that the rebels believed that the real enemy in the conflict wasn't France, because if Algeria wanted to, it could bleed France dry. The real enemy is the U.S. and NATO, because of the continued support for France financially and with weapons. However, that didn't affect the way that the rebels she was assigned to treated her. She wrote about having a great experience with these men and having pleasant conversations with those who spoke English, and really kind of being taken into the group. This is a quote from her on that. She said, "People who had been shot at with Made in USA bullets or bombed by Made in USA rockets flown aboard Made in USA aircraft looked out for this Made in USA reporter as everybody's little sister." So she had a very good experience, at least what she reported about her time with the FLN. And she had unprecedented access to what they were doing, including getting to cover the trial and execution of a young man who was put on trial for treason. This is the rebel side. He had been kind of recruited to the pro-French side and had been accused of slitting the throats of the women and children in the villages where they were fighting. So that she covered this trial and the execution really is stunning. Just amazing coverage that wasn't really available in the United States. But I'll just show you a few pictures of her experience in Algeria. So this is her right here with two of the men in her unit at formation. Training, planning. This is the discovery. I don't know what the clue is that tells you this is a NATO bomb, but that the men that she's with, they see this and they're like, oh, this is from NATO. So that sparked that conversation of, you know, who is the real enemy of the rebels. She did a lot of portraits of the men in the unit that she was assigned to. You know, kind of a lot of day-to-day things that soldiers in any conflict deal with. Again, this is part of what I really saw as her attempt to humanize soldiers. No matter who they were, what kind of war they're fighting, where they are, there are certain just human experiences in war. And I think she really did a great job of capturing that. This is also a photograph I love, like I love the photograph of the Marine in Iwo Jima. Again, just capturing these human moments of these men who, for so many different reasons, find themselves fighting wars. And she just captured that. These photographs aren't sentimental, they're not overwrought, they're just very human. And I think that's one of her great contributions in terms of her photography. It's an Algerian child, a group of women and children. She also took pictures of, again, the graphic kind of carnage of war. This is one execution. This was not the trial, but an execution that she saw just kind of happen more spontaneously. And then this is the young man who was on trial for treason, for slitting the throats of Algerian women and children. He had gone to the pro-French side. So this is him. She covered the trial, and then she photographed the execution, and this is the execution. So again, I mean, truly unprecedented access that she had to get, and that she was able, you know, that they let her take these pictures is really phenomenal, and that we have this documentary record. So truly amazing details from a conflict that I don't know how much is really known even now among Americans. After Algeria, so she doesn't really stop, she doesn't really go home and take a break. After Algeria, she went to Cuba. And her attitude toward Cuba is fascinating, and it reflected the popular American attitudes towards Cuba in the late 1950s. There's this window of time where Americans, there's a small window, but a window of time in which Americans viewed Fidel Castro and his forces as freedom fighters. So in late 1958 into 1959, Dickey Chapelle was sent to Cuba by Reader's Digest. She was there for 2 months, and she was with Fidel Castro and his forces. And she herself, at that time, saw Castro as a freedom fighter against the oppressive forces of the Batista government. In April of 1959, she received a medal from Fidel Castro for her coverage of the Cuban Revolution. And she's got, again, really amazing images, amazing access that she had. So this is Fidel Castro right here. So lots of images, I'll just show you some so you can get a sense. This is Fidel Castro and his brother Raul. This is a woman named Celia Sanchez, who was one of the main leaders of the revolution. Also, I believe, a girlfriend, mistress of Fidel Castro. Members of the Fidel's forces, Castro's forces. There's Dickey Chapelle. And again, in the late 50s, she sees them as freedom fighters. It's not yet totally clear the direction that Castro's going to go. So she sees him and his forces as freedom fighters. There she is again. But the good feelings didn't last, because as we now know, Castro and his forces committed to communism. That became clearer. So a few years after her time in Cuba, her medal from Fidel Castro, she found her way to the anti-Castro Cuban exiles in Miami, who were plotting an offensive against Castro in Cuba. In late 1963, she went to Miami, found these men. Here's a picture of them. So you can see in a basement somewhere in Miami, weapons, kind of checking out what they have. So these, again, they're anti-Castro Cuban exiles in Miami who are planning an offensive against Castro in Cuba. So Dickey Chapelle gets with them. She's getting to know them. And in January of 1964, she was on a boat with some of these commandos. They were part of a group called Commandos L. She's on a boat with them. They're about 15 miles off the coast of Miami heading towards Cuba when there's a gas leak on the boat and there's an explosion. She was burnt, she received burns on her face and hands. And what was discovered by, I think it was the U.S. Customs that got them, rescued them, the boat, the ship, and 2 other ships with it were filled with machine guns, homemade bombs, and ammunition that was all bound for Cuba, for anti-Castro forces in Cuba. Later, when Dickey Chapelle was writing or talking about the incident, she accused the U.S. of inadvertently supporting Castro because U.S. Customs agents kept preventing these anti-Castro Cuban exiles from leaving Miami and going to Cuba with their munitions. So she was banned from Cuba. So she's banned from Hungary, she's banned from Cuba. But, I mean, she's at the front of all of the, you know, she's definitely at the front of some major action in the early Cold War. Now, Dickey Chapelle's career and her life ended in Vietnam. Before I get to that, just one other picture, not really related to anything I'm going to talk about, but this is a picture, it's kind of dark. It's a photograph of Laotian soldiers playing cards. So again, another one of those images of just kind of the humanness of soldiers. That you can put a U.S. Marine in Iwo Jima, and a picture of him, a picture of Algerian FLN rebels, and a picture of Laotian soldiers together, just kind of like being young men. And again, her ability to capture the humanness of soldiers in her photographs, I think, is really one of her great contributions. So her career and her life ended in Vietnam. She had various journalistic assignments to Vietnam, including a 4-month assignment from National Geographic to cover the war in the Mekong Delta, and a 5-month assignment for Reader's Digest. So, and in total, she took 5 trips to Vietnam. So she spent a lot of time there. In September of 1961, she parachuted with the troops of the 5th Battalion of the Vietnamese Airborne Brigade into Vietnam. I think that might have been her first time parachuting. I'm not 100% sure about that. But she parachuted in with the Vietnamese Airborne Brigade in September of 1961. And then parachuted into Vietnam several more times after that. In 1962, she won the George Polk Memorial Award, which was the highest award of the Overseas Press Club of America for her coverage of the fighting and what was going on in Vietnam. One of her really interesting assignments in Vietnam, just in terms of kind of providing some information about a little-known piece of that very complex story, was an assignment to cover an anti-communist paramilitary militia called the Sea Swallows. So the Sea Swallows were, like I said, a militia, anti-communist militia, in the province of Cà Mau, which is in the very southern part of Vietnam. That province was a Viet Cong stronghold, but apparently the Sea Swallows had been able to make some inroads in terms of taking territory and holding off additional further Viet Cong advances. And it was led by, the Sea Swallows were led by a Chinese Catholic priest named Nguyen Ngoc Hoa. He was a Chinese refugee. He'd been in Vietnam for a long time, but he was of Chinese descent. Catholic priest who was called the Fighting Priest. And that's actually what she titled the article that she wrote for Reader's Digest, The Fighting Priest of South Vietnam. And this picture, these 2 men here are of the Sea Swallows. And what they're holding up is a captured Viet Cong flag. So that, again, you know, one of those little-known pieces of a very complicated story, this militia, that had a little bit of success in trying to hold off the Viet Cong in the early 1960s. So just a couple of her Vietnam pictures. Again, always, in addition to kind of trying to capture the human side of the soldiers, capturing what war did to those who fought it. Her, you know, eating canned food, her sea rations. She wanted to be like the men that she was covering in as many ways as possible, partly because she didn't want to be seen as an outsider who needed something extra. And she was very conscious of that, which makes sense given attitudes towards her and thinking about women being combat photographers, combat reporters. So she was very conscious of wanting to blend in. And so she did everything, she tried to do as much as she could to kind of just be part of the group. This is in Vietnam. This is a picture of her in getting ready to parachute or get on a flight in which we'd then be parachuting into Vietnam in 1963 with the 5th Special Forces. Again, probably like her favorite thing. Just another image of the war. She did capture some images of daily life. This is a picture from a village called Vinh Cui, and it is the villagers removing bodies after a Viet Cong attack. And so again, she also tried to capture not only the effect of war on soldiers, but also on those who happened to be caught in the crossfire. And then another picture from Vinh Cui of children and people waiting for aid, waiting for relief. And then this is a picture of Dickey Chapelle at the Vietnam-Cambodian border. She believed in the cause in Vietnam, and she believed that the U.S. should be fighting there, because again, this was part of her anti-communist stance and her liberal internationalism. And so she believed in the war, and she would try to counter those who were against it, including being part of a counter-demonstration at the University of Wisconsin in 1965. So the University of Wisconsin is very well known for its anti-war activism. In early April of 1965, students and faculty at the University of Wisconsin organized a teach-in where professors held lectures arguing that U.S. involvement in Vietnam was wrong. Well, Dickey Chapelle joined a counter-demonstration that had been organized. Remember, she's from Wisconsin, even though she hasn't lived there for a long time. That's where she's from. She joined a counter-demonstration that was organized by 3 students, one of whom was an ex-Marine. But she joined the counter-demonstration, and she made her own argument for why she believed the U.S. should be involved in Vietnam. Now, coverage of both events in the Wisconsin State Journal, which is the main daily newspaper in Madison, Wisconsin, where the University of Wisconsin is located, wrote that about 200 students attended the pro-war demonstration, whereas about anywhere from 900 to 1,000, according to that newspaper, attended the anti-war demonstrations. But the article did say that those who were interviewed who attended the pro-war demonstration described themselves as belonging to the frustrated majority on campus. So, not sure if they were or not, but she was part of a really high-profile moment in our understanding of the history of the U.S. and the Vietnam War, except on the other side of what we typically think of when we think of the University of Wisconsin during that period. Out of that counter-demonstration was formed a group called the Committee to Support the People of South Vietnam, which was a group that argued that everyone in the world should have the right to self-determination, but in a climate that was free of terrorism, manipulation, and intimidation. And this group argued that the VC did all of those things. It coerced people, it terrorized people, intimidated people, and so they argued that we believe in self-determination. We ultimately don't believe in imperialism or neo-imperialism, but we only think that the U.S. should be hands-off if we can be convinced that people are determining their future, their political future, without being coerced, manipulated, and so on. After that demonstration, she eventually went back to Vietnam. And this picture I like of her, it may be hard to tell because of the lighting and everything, but she's got a huge smile on her face. And one of the things that I read about when I was reading people describing her is that she had, as annoying as she was annoying to many of the American troops that she was with. And I'll say a little bit about that in a second. As annoyed as men got with her presence, they often remarked that she had a real zest for life, she loved what she was doing, she just wanted to be part of it, she wanted to get the best story she could, and she was constantly asking questions and happy and smiling, and so I think that picture of her really kind of captures that aspect of her personality that I saw again and again in accounts of her. Well, she went back to Vietnam in 1965, and on November 4th, while she was out on patrol with Marines in Chu Lai, which is in central Vietnam, or at the time I Corps, the northern part of South Vietnam. The lieutenant walking in front of her tripped the wire of a booby trap. Shrapnel hit her in the neck, and the shrapnel hit her carotid artery, and she bled to death. She was 47 years old. And so she died doing what she loved, but she missed most of the Vietnam War, and it's interesting that she's remembered for dying in Vietnam when that was the very end of her career. But one of the things that I've been thinking about in thinking about her and preparing this talk, and this is where we'll end, is how should we remember her? Was she a woman who happened to be present at these major transformative events in the history of the Cold War? Or was she a war correspondent and a journalist who happened to be a woman? Well, I think the answer is actually both. And that's not a cop-out answer. I think it's both. And this is why. For her, as well as for many of the men that she was covering, the fact that she was a woman mattered. And so we really can't separate that from her experience. I'm going to read two quotes about her, written by two different men after she died, and kind of writing commentaries about her after she died. So this first is from a man named William Giles, who was her editor at National Geographic. He said, "Because she was so good, and because she was a woman in a trade that men like to think they dominate, Dickey Chapelle bred a certain amount of resentment among some of her male competitors. Try as she might, Dickey could never fully dissipate the natural emotions of admiration and jealousy." And then this next excerpt is from a man by the name of Richard Starnes, a Marine. He wrote a piece about her after she died. He opened it by talking about the last time he had seen her, which was in the Mekong Delta. And he was saying goodbye to her and feeling relieved that she was, as he said, going to plague some other outfit for a few days. Because he went on to say that he and all the other Marines who encountered her knew something bad was going to happen to her. They all knew that her story was not going to end well. And it was another thing they had to worry about in an already tense situation. And maybe they didn't have to worry about it, but they thought that they did. They thought that as long as she was around, they were going to have to worry about her. And it was, so therefore it was a strain having her around, even though personally they liked her. I mean, on the one hand he's saying, you know, thank God she's gone, but she's always the person showing up with the bottle of gin, and she's great, and we like her. So they liked her personally, but they felt that they had to protect her, and that added another strain to what they were already trying to deal with in Vietnam. And so he said this about her. He said, "You couldn't really know whether she was a very brave person or whether she was just a woman had-ridden with some dark compulsion to prove that she was as good as any man on earth." And, you know, she herself entitled her memoir, "What's a Woman Doing Here?" So even for her, the fact that she was a woman mattered. I mean, as much as she tried to make that a non-issue, she understood that that mattered in terms of the way that people interacted with her, what she was able to do, and that sort of thing. So it's very difficult to separate her fact of being a woman from what she experienced. However, the articles she wrote, the photographs she took, offer such a great lens on American attitudes and policies in the early Cold War, and the information that we get from those matters outside of the context of her gender. So that's how I see that really it is both. I mean, we can't not think of her, we can't just think of her as a war correspondent, but the fact that she was a woman, and even that she was killed in Vietnam, is really one of the two of the least significant things about her in terms of what we learn from her writings and her photographs. Like I said, the images that I used in the PowerPoint are from the Wisconsin Historical Society, which has digitized nearly 500 of her photographs. And so if you're interested in seeing more of the work that she's done, you can browse the collection by going to wisconsinhistory.org. And if you click on Search Images, which is a button kind of in the middle of the homepage, click that button, and then there will be a search field. The page that it'll take you to, there's a search field kind of in the middle of that page. You type in Dickey Chapelle, and you'll get the database. It's like 480 some images that she did. This month, the Milwaukee Press Club is going to induct Dickey Chapelle posthumously into the Milwaukee Media Hall of Fame. And the Milwaukee Press Club Endowment is funding an initiative to encourage young women to go into journalism in honor of Dickey Chapelle. So her legacy still goes on. I thank you all for coming, and I will be happy to answer any questions you might have.
3 questions. How did you get interested in her? Is a memoir still in print, and are you considering doing a biography?
Okay, so how did I get interested in her? It goes back to that picture on Facebook. I think this must have been around the anniversary of her death, that I saw a picture on Facebook. I had known about her kind of, you know, on the periphery of my knowledge about the Vietnam War. And I saw a picture of her, and so I shared it on my Facebook wall. And then I got an email from Susanna. I was in Vietnam at the time. And she said, you know, how much do you know about her? Because this would be a great talk. And I said, well, I know that all of her papers are at the University of Wisconsin, at the Wisconsin Historical Society. And my husband lives in Wisconsin. We're going to be there this summer, so I can easily do research on her. So that's how I got interested in her. And I thought, this will be, you know, kind of an easy, maybe a little bit boring talk. And then I got into the collections, and I realized how much material there was on her that said to me so much about the kind of liberal internationalist perspective that Americans had in the early Cold War about humanitarian aid and kind of going off in the world and bringing democracy and all of this, that I realized that she is much more than a correspondent who died in Vietnam, but she actually is someone through whom we can learn a lot about American policy in the early Cold War, before Vietnam. Her memoir, you can get it on Amazon. And actually, the National Archives digitized the entire memoir, so you can read it online for free. Maybe I will do a biography of her. Doing the research for the talk definitely made me feel like this is a project that's down the road, so maybe I will. Thank you.
Do you think because she was with Fidel Castro, that's why she went with the counter-revolutionaries? Because by '63, I mean, Cuba was, you know, that was had fallen. It was kind of a lost cause.
Yeah, exactly. So that window of kind of seeing Castro as a freedom fighter had closed. Castro was clearly going towards communism. So because of her staunch anti-communism, she was definitely not going to support him anymore. And in fact, even, you know, it wasn't as though he suddenly became communist. That was there. And in one of the articles she wrote about Castro's forces, she was talking about the women and how she really admired them, except that she was disturbed by what seemed to be their interest in communism. So she was aware that that was on the table, and then it became clear by 1960. So yeah, that's exactly right.
A comment and question. You know, for someone who died in their 40s, she had already written her own memoir. She really had already, at an early age, had an idea of her place in history and her profession, and just in history in general. So it's really interesting to me. She went by a name that is more traditionally male. Is it possible that early on in her career, maybe she got assignments because they didn't know who they were getting, essentially, and she showed up and, hey, you know, this isn't the guy we thought we hired.
Right. That's a really good question. Maybe. Yeah, I don't know. I didn't come across that, but that's entirely possible. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Dr. do you have an opinion on, as you pointed out, given the era that she was in, that she was kind of considered kind of in the way? But all the things that she did as a groundbreaker, do you have an opinion on how much, if any, she had an impact in terms of paving the way? Because all over TV today, all over the news, you see as many or more women in the war zones in the Middle East that you would not have seen then. Do you think she had an impact on that?
I would think that maybe kind of in an indirect way, that the men that she encountered, you know, if they stayed in the military, sort of moved up in their career, they had already had a woman correspondent. So as we're moving into the late 60s, into the 70s, in the 80s for sure, when those positions are becoming more available to women, in that way she might have begun a cultural shift in terms of making the military, the branches of the military troops aware that women do this. And you know, she wasn't the only woman correspondent. I mean, there was a woman named Marguerite Higgins who was in Vietnam. She also died early, but she got sick. She wasn't killed in the war. She was in Vietnam in the 50s, early 60s. And Martha Gellhorn, who was a World War II correspondent. So there is this kind of group from World War II through early Vietnam who were doing this. They were definitely in the minority. And so I think maybe them together started a cultural shift that then led to the later expansion of opportunities for women.
I've read both, What's a Woman Doing Here and Fire in the Wind, and the books kind of paint two different pictures of her, and so it's kind of confusing to me, you know, like which is the real Dickey Chapelle, because the Fire in the Wind basically said that she made herself more important than she was, but from reading her book, her own book, and the experience she had, it seems to me like, I think she didn't tell us a lot of stuff that really happened.
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of wondering, where do you think there was a disconnect between the two books?
Yeah, I mean, you know, as writing a memoir, she was in control of the story that she wanted to get out. And being that this was published at a time where the fact that she was doing this was shocking, let alone like if she really told everything that happened, I could see why she would want to maybe have kept some of it off the table. And also, if she wanted to continue working, there might have been a concern that if newspapers, magazines learn that I'm doing all these things behind the scenes and kind of going away from where I'm supposed to be, that I'm not going to get jobs. In terms of the author of Fire in the Wind kind of making her out to not have been that important, that book is a fine biography, but it doesn't put her in the historical context. And it really doesn't use her as a lens on these bigger issues like US policy in the world and that sort of thing. And so I think that if we just look at her alone, I could see how that author would say, well, yeah, I mean, she was, you know, she covered these places and that's interesting, but so what? But if we put her in the historical context and really read what she's writing about and look at her pictures and analyze them, I think we can see her as more important than just somebody who was there. So, Shane?
So Dickey Chapelle, she believed in liberal internationalism and supported the Vietnam War, among other things. But gender norms and political ideology, they're obviously related, but separate, right? And I think here's was what is especially striking, because while I think that there's a gendered norm that is assumed to go with liberal internationalism, but the role, the sort of niche construction, the cultural development that her and other female or correspondents are creating is undermining of the liberal internationalism of the mid-20th century, right? So my question then is, in what ways, how was she on the gender norms? Did she cater or accommodate paternalist ideals in navigating social terrain and institutions, or did she believe those ideals as well?
That is a great question. I think in a way she did further some of those gender norms in her coverage. The way that she talked about men or women that she was studying, say for example, when she was in Iran or in Algeria, she was not talking about women's liberation or how might democracy advance not just kind of women helping their families, but advance the cause of women. On the other hand, in covering those development programs, she was very supportive of education for young women and girls. So, but does that mean that she's challenging the norm, or that because educating women and girls is part of liberal development. So, yeah, and then as for herself, she didn't talk about that at all. I mean, that was not a concern for her, that she didn't see herself as a pioneer in any kind of like restructuring of gender. She just wanted to go out and cover war stories and cover global events. So she wasn't talking about that. So I think probably she furthered the gender norms in her coverage, even though she as a person and what she was doing may have contributed to rethinking of what women can do in a free society. That's a great, actually I'm going to have you write that down for me, that question. It's a really good question. Thank you.
All right, join me again in thanking Dr. Stur. And if I can hold your attention for just a little bit longer, please make sure you pick up a flyer on your way out. next Tuesday as our next Warren Society Roundtable book discussion at the Hattiesburg Public Library. And just, there was a lot of talk on the radio and TV this weekend about what an amazing weekend it was for Mississippi, and they were talking about football, and I was like, hey, there's another school, by the way. I guess I just want to bring to your attention the fact that when people want to know about what people are doing in cutting-edge research on Vietnam, they know that Heather Stur is in the Dale Center, and that your support, and it can be financial, we certainly appreciate that, but if it's just in terms of spreading the word about what we're doing in the Dale Center, and what our students are doing in the Dale Center, and how our university is really supporting us, in a time when it's not always easy to support everything you want to. Help us spread the word about what we're doing, and if you need help understanding what we're doing, there are flyers over there. So thank you all very much, and have a great night.